This is the Infotagion podcast, discussing information contagion and our rights in a digital world. For many people, their beliefs and sense of identity is increasingly shaped not just by the communities they live in, but those that they have adopted online. This is changing the norms of social behaviour and has encouraged both more extremist speech and, in some cases, violent behaviour. I'm Damian Collins, and in this podcast, we'll be discussing these issues with the writer and journalist Matthew d'Ancona, who has published his latest book, Identity, Ignorance, Innovation: Why the Old Politics is Useless and What to Do About It. We'll also be hearing from our regular guest, the disinformation analyst, Dr. Charles Creel.
Matt, it's really great to have you with us on the Infotagion podcast. There's a lot I think we can discuss, but I wanted to start off with your new book, Identity, Ignorance and Innovation. And there was a theme that you touch on there, which I think is really interesting and so true for, I think, the politics we see today and this whole debate around freedom of speech online and the crossroads between freedom of speech and the harm which it can cause. And that is the point you make, that during the Cold War, when we used to talk about the importance of freedom of speech, we were talking about people like Lech Wałęsa in Poland speaking out against communist dictatorship. Today, it seems to be more the right people have to make racist or marginally racist comments on social media. And what do you think that says about the world we live in today?
Well, nothing good. But of course, you're right. And one of the problems for people like myself who feel very strongly about the value of freedom of speech, or I should say, a predisposition towards freedom of speech, because very few people are free speech absolutists in practice, is that value has means different things in different times, or is rather subjected to different tests at different times. So, it's interesting because my very first job in journalism was working for a magazine, a human rights magazine, Index on Censorship, which still exists and is a brilliant publication. And the whole milieu there was that free speech was a progressive value, as indeed it had generally always been. One thinks back to the Berkeley protests, Mario Savio, and even further back, you can go back to Frederick Douglass. It was a great, the abolitionist was a great sort of champion of free speech as a means of protecting the rights of the excluded and the disenfranchised. And so, in a sense, during the my formative years, the end of the 20th century, there was kind of no doubt that free speech was a value on the side of the angels and a protection against mob rule and authoritarianism and so on. As in so many other respects, the technological revolution has transformed that because, of course, the means of production are now effectively zero cost, and anyone can say anything to anyone. So we've suddenly seen a different problem, which is that we live in an age of Babel. We thought back in the early 90s that there was quite a lot of communication going on with multi-station television and lots of quite raucous newspapers and so on. But that was a mere dress rehearsal for what was coming. So we're presented with a much more nuanced situation now, I think, which is where you want to keep an eye, and a vigilant eye on a value that is not very well loved at the moment. If most of the polling shows that particularly younger people don't think of free expression as a very important value, to which I always say, yes, but be careful, because you'll need it sometime. It's fine. It's fine to talk about not needing free speech when you're talking about kicking President Trump off Twitter, but what if the boot is on the other foot? So be careful. So you have that sort of lack of enthusiasm for free speech, but on the other hand, you do have legitimately the question of, as you said, question, David. The proliferation of online harms, which is something about which in your inquiries you've done as much as anyone really to sort of explore. And clearly we do need new regulatory frameworks. And I think it's very important. And my personal view is that I'm quite keen on democratically elected politicians overseeing regulatory authorities doing that, rather than Mark Zuckerberg just deciding who and who doesn't have a platform. I'm all in favour of a measure of self-regulation. I think that's important, but I think there's a danger in what amount to near monopoly big tech companies essentially deciding who and who doesn't get to have a voice. And so I think we stand at a kind of crossroads on this, because what disturbs me is the, with noble exceptions such as yourself, the politics has found it hard to keep pace with technology in all of this. And that's not terribly surprising, because the technology is moving so fast, but we need to catch up.
I think that's right. And I think it's because I think there are people who, rightly and understandably, start taking the view, well, if you start banning speech, which is not illegal, but you bang it because you disagree with it, you find it upsetting, then that can take you in a problematic place. And I think and you'd want to guard against that. And I think you're right. If you start removing speech that you don't like and undermining freedom of speech, one day that could come back to get you. But I think there's something very different at play now, which is that it's not just the question of people saying sort of things that people disagree with. And indeed, I think the whole argument against Donald Trump was that not even the President of the United States can be innocent of incitement or inciting violence through their speech that will lead to harm. That you don't have a protection to do that, even if you're the president. But this question of this speech that causes harm, of course, action should be taken against it. But there's this other thing which social media does, which is it amplifies speech in a way that no one has the right to have their speech amplified. And what we're talking about is not just individual comments, but the whole flow of comments that can come on social media as people find themselves sort of trapped in bubbles of opinion and thought, which means they largely encounter waves and waves of opinions of a similar nature. And I think that is how conspiracy movements like QAnon have grown. And indeed, that's how I think Donald Trump was able to whip up this storm, alleging that baselessly and wrongly that the election had been stolen from him.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting. Your point about incitement, I think, is a bullseye, which is that we need to think hard about what constitutes incitement, because the bar maybe perhaps should be slightly lower than it traditionally has been in jurisprudence. And when you've got a platform of the scale that Trump had on Twitter, inciting people to violence is not hard. And indeed, we saw him doing it in real life on January the 6th, and very frightening it was too. And so the capacity of social media aligned to other forms of authority and power as a sort of engine of incitement to crimes and to racial harassment and other things is very real. And I think your point about proliferation is absolutely correct, which is that we're not talking about just one man with a megaphone at Hyde Park Corner here, or the right to walk up and down Oxford Street with a sandwich board. We're talking about the capacity to get into millions, many millions, perhaps hundreds of millions of people's phones at the press of a button. And this is a kind of power that has never existed before in human history, and therefore it needs fresh thinking. And as I say, I think that what's alarming is that a lot of the debate is quite analog and not really, if you like, informed by a knowledge of quite how powerful this technology is. And as a final thought, I mean, what worries me more is that we're actually heading towards the bookend of one era in this revolution, which is, if you like, the social media revolution, and we're about to begin a new one, which is the AI and machine learning one. after which the problem will become even more complex. So this is a time for, I would have, perhaps it was idealistic, but I hope that a G7 meeting will, at some stage soon, really get its teeth into this. It was perhaps, too much to expect the first one in the pandemic to be able to focus on that. But I really think it is a global problem. Most of the solutions, I'm sure, will be at national level, but the principles that inform them should have at least some sort of global dimension.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And it's I sort of go back to the point you're making about sort of this feeling a bit analog in some ways, the policy response to this at times. And it's interesting, I think, that in some ways the tech companies are encouraging that. The whole way the Facebook Oversight Board is set up is sort of like how a complaints department might have been 50 years ago, in that you have a board of people that consider decisions Facebook have made about content to remove, and they review those decisions by looking at the content, almost as if they probably are sort of printed out on a piece of paper. And you look at it, and you look at one individual posting, and you say, well, should that have stayed up, or should it have been taken down? Then you move on to the next one, without recognizing that yes, that one post could have done harm, but the greater harm might have been caused through the proliferation of that post, and indeed whether the company actively encouraged people to look at that post by allowing its algorithm to promote it. And until we have that level of oversight of the way these companies work, the decisions that they make, what they can see about how content spreads on their platforms, and they can be held accountable for that, then we won't have an effective system for challenging what's happening today.
Well, exactly. And I think that the way in which algorithms are treated as the sort of sanctum sanctorum, the black box that it's totally unreasonable to expect any company to disclose, is preposterous. Until we are able, in some shape or form, or however limited, to get access to algorithmic information, it will be impossible to regulate technology properly. And this is not a marginal issue. It's at the heart of how democracy now functions. And I do find myself irritated by the way in which tech companies sort of clutch their pearls when asked to reveal literally anything about the algorithms they'd use, as if this was sort of by definition unreasonable and impertinent. Far from it. The algorithms are no more or less than the rules which govern the kind of information to which we are now have access, and to which towards which we are now driven. I think as a citizen, I have a right to know at least something about that. I don't want to, steal all of Mark Zuckerberg's intellectual property or anything like that. But I do think I have a right to know why it is that this particular advert lands on my page.
I think it's interesting that the approach the UK government is taking through the currently a draft online safety bill is quite interesting. It's interesting as well that it applies quite an old idea in English law of duty of care to a very modern problem. But I think it could potentially be an interesting solution where we say to a tech company, you can't expect us, the government or the civil service or parliament, to understand your algorithms better than you do. But actually what we can do is say there are certain safety standards we expect you to meet. And we don't even necessarily have to prescribe what they all are. But if we feel you've fallen below them, then action could be taken against you because you failed in the duty of care that you should have exercised.
Yes, exactly. And that is carries within it the sort of legislative equivalent of the last chance saloon, which is, okay, here's a way of doing it where you do have to do it yourself, and we're not actually opening the black box, but we entrust you to do this, and you have to deliver. My query is, well, let's judge it by its results, assuming it becomes law, that it will be interesting to see how companies pursue that duty of care. They tend to be, they've shifted away from the pretense that they're just platforms, which is a considerable win. But they've yet, to my mind, to embrace the responsibilities that they actually have within a modern social fabric. And it's down to individual nation states to legislate accordingly. This is a proper, as technologically speaking, this is one of the biggest challenges to how democratic civil society works, in history. And there's absolutely no need to be Luddite or hostile, or even to think that the technology is bad, because it isn't intrinsically bad. But it is technology of absolutely extraordinary power, and it's unreasonable of the companies to expect to be given a completely free passage, as indeed any commercial operator can expect not to be given a free passage. I do think part of it is that it's all happened so quickly. Facebook was only invented in 2004, which in terms of business maturation is a heartbeat. And so it is interesting how I think we now stand at a very important sort of decision moment. As we hopefully exit the pandemic, what are we going to do about this? And if multilateralism is indeed back, are we capable of coming to something like supranational solutions to this?
Yeah, I think that it's always a bit of tension, and there has to be some consensus amongst particularly the Western, what we might call the Western countries, about this approach. I certainly think there should be some general principles that we apply in terms of the responsibilities tech companies have, and there's some interesting ideas that are being developed as well. I mean, we don't all necessarily have to do it exactly the same way, and sometimes I think when people, certainly when the tech companies call for an international solution, it's in the hope it'll take a long time to find one. But there's things we can do sort of on the way. I mean, and learn from each other. I think people have been interested. We're interested in the dispute between the Australian government and Facebook and Google over paying for news content. The whole world was watching that to see how the companies would respond. Something we've talked about on this show before is there's very interesting development in Washington State in America around, I think, facial recognition technology, where you have to go through sandbox trials before the product can go live to demonstrate that it is safe and there aren't any unintended consequences of using it. And that's quite an interesting idea too, because in many other industries, when you launch a new product, you have to have gone through some sort of safety trials before you do.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I don't really see why this should be different. And indeed, although it's by no means perfect, the European, the EU regulations that were issued in April on AI and so on have some really, some really good elements in them. Partly, a sandbox dimension, and also an attempt to force companies that are engaged in machine learning and, to your point, facial recognition technology, that they have a duty of care, and that these are technologies where the consequences can be in and of themselves undesirable, but B are only as smart as the algorithms. And we know from the already well sourced evidence that that facial recognition can embed and bake in fantastically prejudiced assumptions, particularly related to ethnicity. And this is 101 stuff to me, which is in the same way as Pfizer and AstraZeneca had to go through some sort of regulatory approval before they're allowed to get their vaccines out into market. The same sort of approval process should be, or something analogous to it at least, should be the case with technologies of this power.
Yeah, and I think it takes us to a place where we're seeking to have some oversight and some regulatory framework around technology companies sort of for their core business, which is the development of products and apps and services. And so that if you're regulating a company like Facebook, you're regulating them as much around whether or not they've acted to remove content other people have posted that shouldn't have been there, as you are whether their tools are actively promoting harmful content. So it's not just about what the users do on the platform, it's the way the technology has been designed and the consequences of those design decisions.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that, again, we come back to the privilege that actually, partly by accident, tech companies have been accorded, which is a much greater degree of commercial confidentiality than is reasonable to expect in any other market. And I think partly it was because, when Facebook, for instance, and certainly Twitter launched, its power was very far from evident. I mean, Twitter started out in a very different form, and I know it was much more sort of people just popping up little posts from around the world, and you could see them on the map. It was more or less saying, hello, I'm in Minsk, and the idea that it would become this kind of engine of the world, sort of global pub fight was very far from clear, but so it has become. And I think, again, it's because we know so little about what lies behind the Wizard of Oz's curtain. It's very difficult to know what technology is going to turn into. Now, if you add into that at the next phase, which will be that the technologies start developing, by themselves, so to speak, that they are learning how to develop organically, it becomes all the more important that we are able to chase it to some extent. And it is because of I was going to say the imminence, but in fact it's already happening. The AI revolution that will be sort of phase 2 in this century, that I think we need to really get a grip on this.
Yeah, and I think, as you said, when technology developed itself based on learned, the observation of learned behaviours, looking at the way humans use technology, that could make a lot of these problems worse. I think the content issues could become a lot worse when we very rapidly get into a world where it's impossible to tell the difference between fake content and real content in terms of production quality. But I'm interested also in the overall effect on this too. And I mean, do you feel that actually social media today is shaping behaviours? I mean, we couldn't have seen the rise of a movement like QAnon, conspiracy network. I don't believe that would have been possible in the world before social media. But is it shaping opinions, or is it just drawing out prejudices that people may have already held?
It is shaping opinions because, it's possible to overstate the pre-digital era's purity. We weren't all sort of living in an enlightenment salon until we got smartphones. However, what our access to these devices and the platforms that we have on them has done is change the way that we, subconsciously or otherwise, arrive at the opinions that we do. And the reason for this is that they drive us towards the like-minded. Now, people say, yes, but that was always the case, in the sense that one tended to huddle in real life around people who were similar and, from a similar background or similar views. And there's an extent to which that's true. But this is now happening at a much greater scale, an unprecedented scale, which is that your feeds on your social media platforms will be absolutely packed with people and posts that reinforce what you think already. So, and also introduce you. There's a kind of narcotic dimension to social media, which is it will introduce you to the next level, the next harder drug, which is why conspiracy theories fare so well on social media, because they provide a spurious sense of order and explanation in a world where everything is kind of constant bombardment, constant apparent chaos, information chaos, and along come people with extremely ordered explanations as to why things are happening. Now, the fact these explanations are entirely incorrect, wrong, come in many circumstances from a bad space and are purely malicious, is not the key point in their adhesiveness. Their adhesiveness is to do with the extent to which they give people a sense, of understanding the world that has baffled them hitherto, and B, a mild sense of, or perhaps a great sense of privilege, because they are suddenly enter into the sanctum of knowledge and understanding. That you are given the key to the door, and you walk through the door, and there is clarity. There is the things I see. I now understand why the world works as it does. And social media, as it turns out, is a fantastically good way of spreading conspiracy theories, and they've become. I think it's too late to rename them, but there is a sort of idea. People, when they use the words conspiracy theories, still think of people arguing about the Roswell UFO incident, Loch Ness Monster, and so on, and they have the kind of tinfoil hat imagery. But actually, conspiracy theories have moved now to the very center of politics, and that was overwhelmingly clear from what happened in January in the United States, that the conspiracy theories are not now at the fringe of political life and activity. They're at the very center of it. And so we can carry on using the term conspiracy theories, but we shouldn't use it as a way of a dismissive term, because to do so misses the point of how central they've become to political explanation.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think the license it has given people, and not just to hold contrary opinions, but actually even to question the validity of democratic institutions in their own right. And it's astonishing, I think, since January when Joe Biden became president, it is now not a shock to hear people in America even questioning whether there should be some sort of second American Revolution, and that the democratic institutions of the United States should be replaced by some other form of
Yes,
government.
I mean, I always think that people who ask, is Trump going to run in 2024, are asking the wrong question, which is that it's a question that has a huge gravitational pull, because one wants to know the answer. But the really interesting thing is how the myth that the election was stolen, and the counterattack that all sorts of state legislation needs to be passed to prevent, comparable, in inverted commas, theft next time, is going on as we speak. And so you see this, to me, truly astonishing side of the Republican Party, which always struck me as being a party that had, a fringe and, a strongly religious dimension, but also a very a kind of robust center that was represented in people who are now, like Mitt Romney and so on, and George Bush Sr. and so on, who would always keep control of it. That has gone completely, and so the next electoral cycle in America will be one that is governed by, as you say, a movement that has an almost apocalypticist and certainly revolutionary mindset, and none of that would have been possible without social media.
Well, it seems like a good point to bring in Charles Creel, who's with us again and has been listening to our conversation. Charles, it's great to have you with us as well. This is territory you know well, but what's caught your attention in the last few days?
Oh, thanks, Damian. Well, being down in Alabama right at the moment, I'm right down in the middle of it. And certainly what Matthew says is true. There's an awful lot of people out there expecting revolution in the coming years. It'll be interesting to watch that play itself out. There's also a new skirmish in the information wars that's broken out this week in Austin, Texas. It's coming right on the heels of what's kind of a daily ritual in the U.S., which is mass shootings. The facts on this story run kind of like this. On Saturday, 13 people were injured in a mass shooting on 6th Street, which is a little party district of Austin, and one of them later died. Police then reported that a juvenile had been jailed in connection with the shooting, and then police and prosecutors are currently running up against the deadline to file charges against this juvenile before they have to release him as a suspect. And a second suspect has been arrested, who's 17 years old, not a juvenile, was taken into custody in Killeen shortly after that. pretty straightforward story, but where it becomes odd is in the reporting of it. Within hours of the incident actually happening, police released a description of the juvenile suspect. And just as quickly, Austin's left-leaning newspaper, the Austin American-Statesman, announced that they would not include the description of the suspect as it was, quote, too vague at the time to be useful in identifying the perpetrator, and that its publication could be harmful in perpetuating stereotypes. Now, that's an unusual step, to say the least. The description was, though, of a, quote, thin black man with dreadlocks wearing a black shirt, which is not that useful of a description, frankly. So shortly after this, Andy Go, who's the author of Unmasked: Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy, so he's not a man without an agenda, he dryly tweeted the Austin American-Statesman's decision, and that started a comments battle in his feed. That then caught fire. It quickly turned into a trending story on Reddit. The left-leaning audience there weighed in for the Statesman, while Go's Twitter following has favored the writer. And here we are discussing it now, as are others. But what makes Go's tweet so powerful is that his Twitter reach at least appears to be twice the reach of the newspaper itself, and that's if you include their standard circulation, however it is we measure that these days. So Go's Twitter storm has also done another thing. It's ended up impacting the dialogue that has surrounded the story, because immediately after the Saturday incident happened, right in the wake of the shooting, online and editorial conversation turned toward Texas's lax gun laws, and particularly the state's attitude toward specialized equipment like assault rifles and silencers and taxes on them and licensing and so on. But now the conversation, and potentially the bad guy, that is all circling around the position of the Austin American-Statesman and the description of the assailant. It's convenient for Go's audience. It may not have been deliberate, but it's certainly convenient. And meanwhile, this was the 246th mass shooting in the United States this
year. Pretty sobering stuff. I mean, what are the statistics like in America at the moment in terms of shootings like this? I mean, are we seeing a rise in the last year or so compared to previous levels?
246 seems high to me. I'm not quite prepared to defend that against facts, so don't anybody take this home as fact. But on average, there's a mass shooting nearly every day in the United States, and the final figure usually hovers somewhere around 350 to 400. If we're at 246 at this point, it looks like it might be high this year, yes.
Yeah. I mean, Matt, it's interesting talking to Charles about that. And again, the question of the way in which what people are exposed to on social media can enforce and reinforce behaviours. Obviously, thankfully, we don't have the same sort of problems that America does with shootings in public, but we've seen in the last year quite significant rises in racially motivated crimes, for example, and racist abuse. Absolutely,
and I think Charles's point about the way in which things can be framed and reframed is super important, because social media can kind of act as a compass to people's understanding of an event, and often in a way that's malicious, unpleasant, and I've absolutely no doubt that the continued kind of, and indeed the increase in racial attacks in some areas and affecting some ethnicities has as its backdrop the kind of torrent of hate that you get on some platforms, and often thinly disguised, but it's there, and it's very hard to chase, because it moves from one platform to another, and it's now moving into the gaming world. And so I mean, to me, this is absolutely at the heart of the whole battle, because what's sort of rather softly called culture wars is undoubtedly revving up in the United Kingdom in a way that 15 years ago would have been unthinkable. And the sort of sharp and horrific end of culture wars is physical attack. And I see it in the way, for instance, that I mean, it's a funny example, but the row about footballers taking the knee and fans booing in football is one that really should not be as aggressive as it has become. This is a matter of footballers showing respect towards the principle of racial justice. There are some people who think it's too performative. That really is the end of the matter. But it's become alarmingly a kind of a sort of, if you like, a kind of public dramatization in sport of some extremely ugly sentiments, which have their digital twins online. And this is the problem: is that arguments which in the past would have been just in and of themselves what they were are now proxies for other things. And digital culture is very good at that, which is, what you worry about constantly is, what are people actually talking about when they take a position online about taking the knee? Very often what they are doing is expressing a much symbolically a much stronger and nastier opinion about race. And this involves enormous subtlety. And as we know, anyone who's taken an interest in the alt-right in America knows how incredibly sophisticated some of the symbolism used by the alt-right is, both pictorial and verbal. And you have to be quite expert to chase it, which is why I think that if we're talking about regulatory authorities, they're going to be quite large, and they're going to have to involve people of quite deep learning and understanding and nimbleness in pursuing this. Because what's certainly striking to me is it's a bad idea to underestimate the intelligence and wit and cunning that often underlines bad actors online, and of which they're capable.
Yeah, I think
it's interesting
and if anything, we're looking at someone like Steve Bannon. I remember when Charles was advising the Select Committee several years ago now, when we first started the disinformation inquiry. I think one of the starting points was what Steve Bannon had learned from the gaming industry about what was possible in terms of identifying and targeting people online, and actually was, along with Cambridge Analytica, were deploying tactics that were far ahead of what anyone else was doing at that time.
Yeah, and in fact, interestingly, Bannon and his people, Yiannopoulos, ended up leveraging Gamergate in the election for Trump. It's interesting what you say, Matthew, about the symbolism of the alt-right or the far right in America. One of the things that we've seen here is the flying of the Confederate flag in the American South has, for my entire lifetime, been a fairly common thing, but it's also been a great big symbol of who you are and what you stand for in terms of racism. And recently, NASCAR last year banned the flying of the Confederate flag at NASCAR events, but now it's largely been replaced by the Police Lives Matter flag, which is a kind of black and white American flag with an extra dark stripe right underneath the stars. And so this kind of complex imagery has been developed by the far right because, on the one hand, they are flying a flag in support of the police, but on the other hand, it's become a symbol for a symbol that's now been banned, and it still says, "I'm a racist."
It's fascinating, this, to me, because all fascistic, all nativist movements have had this sort of cryptographic, symbolic approach. The famous use of three fingers over the belt to symbolize membership of the KKK long before the digital era, and that's now been kind of that's proliferated on a global scale. So you need what we need. We need semioticians as well as coders to keep us abreast of this. People who can understand what exactly is being done when this emoji or that flag or that symbol is being used, and oftentimes it is carefully targeted symbol to directed at a specific audience, saying, I see you, I'm on your side.
So I think absolutely. I think the visual aspect of a lot of this, a lot of what we talk about is often about words, but as we know through history, images can often be far more powerful at creating a sense of identity. And it's interesting when we think about identity now, rather than it being communities that are relatively close, it can be a loose web of people all over the world.
Absolutely, and indeed, often humor. I mean, Pepper the Frog was the sort of the first and most obvious example of it, but it's by no means the only one. Humor can be an extremely powerful part of this, which is the use of apparent irony to broadcast a statement that's actually entirely serious. And so memes are front and center in this, which is something which appears to be just a slightly sketchy joke, can actually be sending a signal out to a vast kind of affinity group about what's going on and where people are. And again, you need to be incredibly well read in and incredibly up to date to know where the thing is going, because it's in the nature of the web that it doesn't have, because it doesn't exist in space, as it were. You don't always know where to look for things.
And I think it also underlines the potential power of new social media platforms, particularly at the moment, the extremely rapid rise of TikTok, that although it looks like a relatively short form of media where people make short and amusing clips and films, you can do an awful lot in that space that TikTok gives you, and you can reach a big audience.
Absolutely, and the more innocent a social media platform looks, the more vigilant we should be, because TikTok, in the same way as Twitter started as people just saying hi from around the world, TikTok has had its beginnings in people doing dances and funny things and so on. But it's also a very, very good place to put a quick, sharp, generally slightly cartoonish message across that can have immense reach. And this involves us to think. I think the problem in all of this really is that we're constantly being called upon to rethink the way that we think politics and social messaging, which is that if you grew up, I'm old, I'm 53, so I grew up in a world in which most of politics was done at an institutional level. Some of it happened at street level, of course, and plenty of it happened on broadcast or in print. But the locations of politics and the rules that governed them were pretty clear. And if you take a question like race, where did the limit lie? Well, the limit lay at precisely the place where Enoch Powell had given his Rivers of Blood speech in 1968, and that was that had set up a border where mainstream politicians couldn't go, and so you kind of knew where you were. Digital culture has totally changed all that, which is, it's not just that the rules have changed, but the locations have changed. So yes, of course, what goes on in the House of Commons remains absolutely fundamental and incredibly important, but it's not the only thing that matters. I've been involved in media organizations that are either sort of mainstream startups or what's now called legacy media for all my career. Do they matter? Of course they do. They're hugely important, but they're not the only place where people get their political content from. Far from it.
I think that's right, and as when we look back over the evolution of broadcasting technology, radio, in the early days of television, at some point an intervention was made to try and safeguard the user interest and to stop that technology being hijacked by extremist voices. That was the birth of the FCC in America, was linked to trying to stop the Nazification of American radio. And I think we should look back at some of those periods and realised there was a reason people intervened in the way they did.
No, absolutely, and not to be afraid of regulation, because all societies regulate, and the question is just how they do it, and to what extent, and above all else, with what intelligence. Because I was, when I first started thinking about this, when I was writing my post-truth book, I thought, well, the last thing we want is a ministry of truth. And I still think that, but at the same time, I think that was a quite a callow thought, albeit at the beginning, because it in fact, every powerful technology, every powerful force in a society requires some form of regulation. And the question is, how do you do it in a way that does not stifle economic enterprise and creativity and so on, but does prevent the very real harms. And I think we've now tested to destruction the principle that this technology can cause considerable harms. And the question really is, what is the response to it? And of course, aligned to that and important to the whole debate is that there are going to be plenty of things on the minds of national governments coming out of the pandemic, and it's going to be an issue is going to need sharp elbows to jostle its way to the front. But I do think that this is very, 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 very central and very, very, very important.
I think that's right, and I think this last year has brought these things into sharper focus with COVID conspiracy theories.
Yeah, absolutely.
Going on, the insurrection in America, that actually it's broken through now as an issue, and I think we see around the world now different governments looking at how they're going to approach regulation in this space.
No, completely.
Matt, it's been brilliant having you on the podcast with us, and Charles, great to have you here again. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Infotagion podcast, hosted by me, Damian Collins, featuring Matthew Dancona and Charles Creel. It was produced by Lucy and David Dargahi. You can also support this show by becoming a Patreon at patreon.com/Infotagion podcast. Infotagion is a not-for-profit organisation, and all the proceeds will go towards the making of this podcast. Thank you. Until next time.